Thank you. Thanks so much to everyone for being here on this lunchtime Zoom. If you're on the East Coast, if you're on the West Coast like me, it's it's just a nice 9:03 a.m. Very sort of good breakfast Zoom. And then if you're in Italy, it's a good sort of aperitif hour. And then if you're in Irkutsk, Russia, I think it's midnight. I looked this up. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. We have a conversation today with the great novelist Dana Spiotta, whose novel WAYWARD, which I will hold up, came out last week. It's just a beautiful and remarkable novel. I'm very, very excited to talk about it. We have an excerpt from it forthcoming in the next issue of N+1, which will be out very, very shortly. I'm sure everyone here knows Dana's work, but in case not, she's the author of 4 other novels: Lightning Field, Eat the Document, Stone Arabia, and Innocence and Others. They're all, they're just 4 of the best books of the past 20 years. Part of what was exciting about this event is getting to look at those books again and see through lines and continuities and sort of disjunctions that I hope we will talk about. What else should I say? Oh, I should say that we have the Q&A open. So I have some questions, of course, that I want to ask desperately, but if you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and either we'll sort of just deal with those at the end or as they come up. You can buy WAYWARD from us through the N+1 shop. That's a great place to buy it because you'll be getting the book and you'll be supporting the magazine, and of course subscribe so that we can keep publishing excerpts of really amazing novels like WAYWARD. Dana, we were talking a little bit yesterday, and we both voiced our aversion to sort of anti-spoiler culture. So if you are extremely squeamish about spoilers, I'm sorry, we might get into it, but mostly that's really just so that we can talk about plot in a sort of open way. But should we start maybe with you reading a little bit of, and do you want to kind of just set up a tiny bit of who is doing the thinking in this section?
Yeah, so this is from the beginning of the book, and this part of the book is narrated. It's mostly in the consciousness of this character, Sam. She's a 53-year-old woman living in Syracuse, and the novel takes place in 2017. And this is, I think that's all you need to know. She's going to, she kind of likes to go to open houses and lurk around. She was the only fantasy lurker attending the open house at 110 Highland Street that Sunday morning. The house was falling apart. The house was beautiful. It had leaded glass windows, built-in shelves, and hidden storage benches. 2 of the benches were framed by wood beam closures, the inglenook, and sat at either end of, what she longed for, an elaborate tile-lined fireplace, Mercer Moravian tiles. The tiles were dirty with layers of dust, but still intact. She could pick out a narrative in the relief images. St. George and the Dragon, the agent said. The clay finish was a rustic, uneven glaze, the colors pink, green, and white. She touched her fingertips to the tiles and felt an undeniable connection. Someone on some podcast had talked about grounding. It was when you walked outside with bare feet and let the earth connect with your body. It was supposed to right you, your circadian rhythms or something, help you get over jet lag, or maybe it was to mitigate the endocrine disruption of chronic toxic exposure, or to counter EMF, the low level but constant electromagnetic waves from Wi-Fi and cellular towers, or maybe all of that, grounding promoted as a systemic cure-all. Sam scoffed at the idea, even despised it as new age crap, yet as her fingers touched the tiles, she felt grounded. There was no other word for it, as if a corrective current flowed from the house through the dusty tile and into her hand and truly her whole body. The tiles were set against patterned deep red brick topped by a mantle made of dark oak, also dirty but intact. Maybe it was Gustav Stickley or it was William Morris who wrote about the arts and crafts ideal, how the fireplace should be a work of everyday art. It looked handmade and warm, and its beauty was in its utility and simplicity. She was cold, she needed a fire. The hearth drew her in, invited her to sit. She now understood the fireplace as a form of secular worship. She imagined it would make her feel close to something elemental. Obviously, the chimney will have to be looked at. To keep her sanity over the long Syracuse winter, Sam needed this beautiful old heat-squandering open fire. At her house in the suburbs, they had a glass-fronted gas fireplace that gave off some regulated, efficient BTUs of heat and a low, exhausting fan hum. The glass flame had a cold blue at its center.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, I'm obviously I'm a sucker for dialogue, for description, for great description of houses, for attentiveness to architecture, and so, you know, obviously this was very exciting right away. This is from very early in the book, but I sort of, you know, a couple things to me sort of really stand out about what you've just read, and one is just the sort of the just the sophistication and intensity of that description. You know, it's obviously written by someone who really, you know, who knows her stuff, who perhaps has attended an open house or two herself, and also then gone and done the research. And the other thing is, you know, is just the sheer sort of contemporaneity of it, with, you know, with the wellness podcasts lurking just under the surface. And I kind of want to sort of throughout this conversation, hopefully talk about both of those elements, the kind of the attentiveness to setting and the sort of attentiveness to the present. But I thought maybe we would start with the latter. And so the book takes place in 2017, shortly after the presidential election. And, you know, I assume that you have been writing it for the past few years. And I sort of, before getting into the kind of like bigger picture questions about writing the present, I wanted to just sort of ask practically how you went about writing a historical novel about the very recent past, where, in a sense, you had to actually sort of be attentive to the fact that so much is happening so quickly, that there are like many things these characters don't know yet, despite the fact that they're not that far removed from us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the right way to approach it, is that the recent past is writing historical fiction. And so I think, you know, I'm always interested in this question of what it's like to be alive now, what it feels like. And sometimes the recent past is a good place to go. As you say, that the present is so, I mean, I think it's always probably felt this way, but it does feel that history is happening so much faster than a writer could possibly keep up with. So I think that you know, the answer for me is to always go really specific and really local. And part of that is, you know, nailing down the time. And so once I had the constraint of it being in the wake of the election 2017, then that constraint enabled me to say, okay, I can talk about this, but I'm still speaking to the present, I hope, in some ways. And I think, you know, that slight dislocation is an interesting place to be. And I guess, yeah, does that answer? I think I got all of that in there.
Yeah. I think I was really just thinking about, you know, how, yeah, I mean, yes, it definitely does. I think, you know, when I first, the excerpt that we have in the book, in the magazine, it's a sort of also an early chapter that's basically sort of the moment in the book that sort of concentrates Sam's post-election angst. That's kind of where we really get the full gamut of her sort of flirtations with like #resistance, and then sort of the deeper corners of that on Facebook and so on. And you know, I was curious about sort of emotionally what that was like for you to write, because I will say that emotionally for me it was a very intense reading experience. I was like, I remember this just happened, and yet it felt like this surge of sort of repressed feeling that it, you know, that I you know, certainly after the election I thought about nothing but the election, and before it too. And yet sort of reading it in early 2021, it really felt as if this new experience that I'd repressed wholesale. What was it like? Was the act of, what was it like sort of narrating that for you?
Well, it is so vivid, you know, and it does sort of feel to me so much like a birth narrative where everyone had to tell the story. I think I mentioned it. It's in the piece that you guys put in N+1, is that, you know, everyone has to tell their really boring story of when they realized that Trump won the election in extreme detail, and it's completely fascinating to them. but they're sort of all the same story. And then there's that also that experience I think a lot of us had where you wake up in the morning and then you remember. And I think, I think for this character in particular, she's middle-aged. And so she's kind of in this weird position, and she's very, she's white, she's privileged, she's had a pretty cushy life in a lot of ways. And I think she's been a good liberal person, and she's knows there's misogyny and racism and inequity and environmental degradation. But I think that she was surprised by this burst of what happened in 2016, and then ashamed that she was surprised. I think she feels herself to be complicit. And so I wanted to capture that feeling of feeling like, both outraged by this misogyny, but then also just sort of like, why is this a surprise? Like, this shouldn't be a surprise. And also the generational anger there, because the young women that were at the resistance meeting she went to get mad at them, the older women, and she thinks, you're right, it is on us because we've been here longer, and so we didn't fix it. I mean, it's a disaster. And that's that part I really felt. I mean, I was really shocked I have a daughter, and was thinking, second wave feminism gave my generation so much, right? We grew up with Sesame Street and everything, and women's rights, and it was great. And we didn't, and we didn't do much with it. I felt kind of, it felt like it was on our generation a little bit, that those people who are, I guess, Gen X, whatever you want to call them, in their midlife. So that kind of that weird implication in the status quo is very much something that Sam is trying to sort out. And that's why, one of the reasons why she needs to change her life, but it's also personal reasons too. Yeah.
Yes.
They're all connected.
I don't want to, I definitely want to get back to the kind of more interior stuff, because, one of the wonderful things about the book is that it is this sort of very much novel of our time, but that's so rich in interiority. And, on top of the kind of the basic sort of literary pleasures of that, it feels really nice to be in someone's head, instead of being in the heads of like a bunch of idiots like oneself on social media. But I did want to ask you about the generational sort of component of this a little more. One of the things that, so for those who haven't read the book yet, and I hope you're just buying it right now as we speak. But in this scene that Dana described, there's this resistance meeting, and these two young women, they kind of come in, they storm out. They're very sort of angry at the sort of Gen X and boomers who are in the room, and they basically say, they're sort of their feminism, such as it is not radical enough for the young women. And that's a scene that, in a novelist who frankly was less open to sort of listening to young people, listening to the way that young people talk and think, that's a scene that could have played out very differently. It could have been a lot more, it could have been a lot more hostile to sort of what these young people are thinking. But you have, throughout the book, this kind of incredible openness to, to sort of to the concerns of people a lot younger than you or me, and indeed, like, a lot of the novel is given over to Allie, the character, the Sam's daughter, and I just wanted to ask you sort of how that. I don't want to be so vulgar as to say, where does that generosity come from? Because I think that's deep within. But I guess, like, where are you sort of listening to young people, and how are you kind of like, where is that sort of sensitivity coming from on a kind of like textural level, day to day?
Well, I mean, I think there's the advantage of getting older is that you can remember what it's like to be 17, and I had that my own memories of being really smart and being also really inexperienced. And so I see that in my daughter's friends, that you don't even know what you don't know because you don't have experience, and you have more certainty about the world. You can make these proclamations, as I did, and you can make these judgments because you're at the beginning. And it's much more humbling to be middle-aged because you have failed to meet all of your ideals, and you've made many mistakes, and and I think that she has that both those characters are interesting to me, and it's not hard to imagine, I think, all these different ages, and also I teach, so I'm around a lot of really smart, interesting young people too, so I think that probably helps with the imagination, the old Faulkner thing about imagination and experience. I think he calls it, yeah, observation, imagination, and experience, but I think of research in there too, and any two of them can make up for the lack of the third. I think that's part of it. But yeah, and I think Sam, I mean, for me, you want to write about these cultural issues, but you have to locate it in these hyper specific people, and they have to be quirky and weird, and they are, and that leads you. Once you believe in them as humans, they kind of have their own wisdom, and they watch them make mistakes and see them in jeopardy, and they kind of tell you what they are. And so that kind of like, once you've made characters that you believe in, you can hear their voice. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that the consciousness of the characters is what the book operates on, at least the first half of the book. And what I think became interesting to me is that her daughter is very different. Her daughter is is sort of playing with this idea of being conservative. She has this hideous libertarian boyfriend / developer guy that she's involved with, and she's she does this, she's in this kind of entrepreneurial club, and she's really but in you start to see, and she really wants to separate from her mother, but as the book progresses, there's a lot of Sam's values are in Allie, but she just needs some space to sort of make her own mistakes, and that was interesting to me that came up.
Yeah, well, and it also, this kind of, yes, her flirtation with sort of libertarianism, which occupies, I mean, I think the bulk of the book, it's also like just a great way to get the words young American disruptors and Joe Rogan into a contemporary novel, which I think is like the task of any great contemporary novelist, is to find ways to get Joe Rogan in there, even if it's someone to be laughed off. So
I have to say, I do think that I captured Joe Rogan's voice pretty well.
Yeah, no,
in the 3 sentences he says in my book. I don't want anybody to think there's Joe Rogan's a big character in my book or anything.
No, he's not a big character, but I think, yeah, but I mean, in fact, like that whole, I think that the way I read some of the libertarianism, or the sort of, the disruption fetish in this book, is that it has this sort of insouciant appeal to a young person who in fact is like, is surrounded by sort of by sensitive and well-meaning and attentive liberalism, and that, I mean, emotionally that feels quite right, and again, it's sort of captured in the book without I mean, with sort of gentle satire, but with nothing like condemnation, which I think is so crucial. I wanted to, because we're kind of getting into structure a little bit, I wanted to talk about it because as you know, I like, when I first read the book, because I was like very desperate for us to excerpt it, and so you very kindly sent me this PDF, and then I was reading the PDF like on my phone at 1 a.m. next to my sleeping daughter, and I had to it was like I had to have it in dark mode so that it wasn't too bright, and so I was just kind of like scanning through my phone. And one of the things that was like immediately of interest to me, but hard to figure out on a PDF, which was, I'm very glad to have the hardcover, is I immediately got curious about what the structure of the book is like, because it has, has these named sections, most at first just for Sam and Allie, and then things get interesting. I want to ask about that. And then it also has this combination of, I saw the first chapter, which is only like a few sentences long, and I was like, I have to confess, I was like I was a little bummed. I was like, oh, is Dana doing the sort of like contemporary, like lots of space thing? Is this going to be, and there's like plenty of great stuff in that mode, but from you, I just like long chapters, and I like a lot of, and so then thankfully by chapter 2, were sort of, I felt great relief. But I did, but there's a lot of variation. There's sort of a lot of variation in length. There's a lot of kind of these section variations. And then of course, like in the second half of the book, and again, I don't even know if it's spoilers, but basically like suddenly these other voices intrude. And I do want to talk about that. So, but can we just, yeah, I mean, I guess the first question is like, at what point in the sort of process of putting this book together did you have a sense that the second half would be quite different? And also kind of, yeah, anything you want to say about the interplay of lengths and voices would be, I think, very, very interesting to me.
I mean, I'm very interested in structure as a way of making meaning. And I think in a long piece like a novel, you can kind of, you can repeat a structural conceit and the reader will connect those two things and make this meaning. So it's, it gives you opportunities beyond, exposition or even like metaphor or repetition. You have these kind of structural analogous sections that speak to each other and make people think, okay, this must be connected to that. So I love that you can do on this macro level all this kind of interesting ways of connecting and making meaning. And so when I'm starting, I'm always imagining like it's going to be this shape and it's going to be this cool thing, and because it's fun to think about, but I know it's never going to be that in the end. And so initially I started with this idea. I mean, some people describe that opening chapter as like a little door, which I think is interesting because does focus on the house. But I did have the Sam sections kind of dilate a little bit. So something will come up and then it'll kind of open up to that, the right after the election, and it will close back up into the scene. So there was this weird dilation that was happening that I thought was interesting. And so, and I had the feeling of in Allie's that wouldn't be, but there would be more of the talking voice to her boyfriend. So there were these kind of like structural things that came up from the sections. And I thought that would be the way the novel would progress. And then as you're working on, I read over everything as I'm writing. Every time I get to an end of a scene, I go back to everything and read everything. And I write sections as they appear in the book. So I'd switch off between the two of them. And I realized that I would have scenes that you would see from Allie's point of view and from Sam's, they'd be repeated. And those were, but as it intensified, I do think the novel itself kind of gets a consciousness. I've talked about this before, where you have character consciousness and you're kind of following that, but then the novel itself has a kind of consciousness, and it can look at things and it can be associative and it can make a leap. And I think it kind of has to make a leap. Like, I think you have a system and you need to kind of swerve in some way, and it has to kind of come organically from where you're going. So I knew that something was going to happen, and I had a kind of idea of what the narrative would be, but I didn't know the structural stuff that would happen. And so the first thing that came up was that the Syracuse stuff. There's a kind of a cabinet of curiosities that comes in, and then I knew that I wanted to hear from this. So Sam works in this historic house, this podunk sort of pathetic historic house of this compromised 19th century feminist character who also lived at Oneida Community for a while. And I've been very obsessed with Oneida forever. And so it was a great, great fun to research it. And I thought, I really want to hear from this person that has been kind of made fun of through the whole book. And I realized as I was writing it, I want to write that. But then I thought, okay, you know what? She's the same age as Allie, maybe it's like this weird. And when I was writing, it's like, oh, this is also kind of an echo of that consent stuff that's happening in the Allie section. So it was so interesting. And that kind of expanded when that happens in the book. So I think the structural stuff is really the whole thing for me,
Yeah, I mean, and as a reader, it's just, so I was like, because of having this PDF, I was just like trying to scroll through and figure out what the different section titles were. And that's not usually something I'm like terribly concerned with as I read, but I just like, I wanted some like guidance, because I was like, what's going to happen? But of course,
oh, so like, you flipped ahead and sort of saw the titles?
Yeah, but again, with like the PDF, like once the flipping options are so limited, but it was actually great because like, of course, the titles gave me nothing. I was like, okay, Sam Alley, Clara Loomis, Syracuse, like these things did not, like it was this funny way where I like wanted to cheat, and in fact I couldn't, because there was only I only could sort of get this through reading the book.
But Mark, I want to interrupt you. What I had originally, which I took out, was I did those kind of like old-fashioned things where at the beginning of a chapter you say everything that's going to happen, which I thought would be a really cool, kind of way of getting the past, a feeling of the past in the book, to structure it that way. And then I realized that was ruinous. It would just be really, really distracting, but I did that for a while. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. I once edited a book where I like it had already come out in the UK, and the only intervention I made was to add those things to the, but it was
really?
nonfiction. So it felt, but it like, and the book already played with this kind of anachronistic mode. So I thought that was a good, and it was so associative that actually like, I felt it was like essential to anyone other than like a diehard reader of this writer, Ian Sinclair, this British writer.
How interesting.
I'm glad you didn't do that, partly because, because like, what's so funny is that I thought about this a lot reading this book, is that, I think in your first couple of novels in particular, like the critical sort of, your critical reputation was as this kind of like cool, sleek, sort of not quite minimalist, but definitely sort of hyper attentive to surfaces novelist, and in the kind of, in the DeLillo, let's say, register, I think. Maybe not quite pushing to his later extremes, but like with a sort of similar hyper attentiveness to, to space and to aesthetics. And then, Stone Arabia, I think of as like this kind of, it makes sense to me that that's like in my experience, like that's the novel of yours that is most people's first Dana Spiotta novel. And it's also the one that I recommend to people, because I just think it's such a kind of, it's such a sort of transitional book. And then it's very easy to go in either direction from that book, because it has a lot of culture and surfaces, but then it also has this kind of real like archaeological intensity to it almost. And then I think of like Innocence and Others as being more in that direction. And then, so this one, it still has, so, I think if you had those like chapter descriptions, that part, perhaps that would have been a bridge too far from the old, cool minimalist self. So I'm glad that we didn't go that. But I was like curious about, like, I wanted to, and maybe we can get back to structure, but the sentences in this book are so, they're so wonderful. They, on one hand, there's still this kind of hyper perceptive gaze that we've always had in your work, but then, especially in the Sam sections, there are these like moments of interruption. There are these sort of parentheticals. There's a lot of if not, there's self-criticism, but also kind of self-correction and an attempt, and a kind of like a transparency about a character needing to find like the right way to think of something and the right way to say something, rather than like a character who kind of has the quippy, snappy answer. And I wondered, did that feel like a conscious shift for you, or was it just, how did that work?
Well, I think that because because the character became about being, trying to figure out how to be different, how to change, how to kind of do the thing she needs to do next, right? That she's she feels she's inadequate to the task at hand. Something has to change. The rest of her life is looming, and she doesn't feel that she's able to meet that. And so she is in a state of constant self-revision. It was funny because last night when I did that event with Rachel Kushner, she said she kind of is her own troll, which is true in a way. And I think it's a good thing to have your own troll sometimes. I think it keeps her honest, but it's also, I think it's also her protection. I think she thinks, well, I'm doing this, hypocritical thing, or but I know I'm doing a hypocritical thing. Like I'm still taking money from my husband, and I'm not really Dorothy Day, but I know it. you know, and I think she sort of thinks that, you know, at least she's not going to be self-deluded about what she's doing. She's going to have this clarity. She's going to insist on that. And I think that's a kind of moral question for that character is, you know, can she really see herself? And if she does see herself, then what, you know? And that's a very, I think it's a hard thing. And I think it was something that came up in Innocence and Others too. That was some question I was interested in, how, you know, the characters who have certainty and the characters who don't. I mean, MH is always making these proclamations in the book, right? And she's kind of like a cult leader. There's a couple cult leaders in the book who are very certain of themselves. And I think that that's a suspect thing to be right now.
Yes.
Or ever, really.
Yeah.
It's okay when you're 17, but not when you're 50. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, like part of the sort of amazing, like the historical texture of the novel is that you have, as you said, right? You're very interested in Oneida, and in general, there's, you know, this great this history of like intentional communities and religious experimentation, you know, in upstate New York, that this novel plays with in all kinds of interesting ways. Was that sort of, because I want to get to Syracuse in a second, but was that like a kind of, was that a parallel? And this sort of, you know, there's this kind of, yeah, there's like cultism, but there's also these like aspirations toward utopia, right, in all these different groups, and in some ways in some of these characters in this book as well. Even in Allie's like pursuit of libertarianism, that's a kind of vision of possibility. Was that like, yeah, were those parallels sort of like on your mind right from the get-go, or did it take, yeah, how did that work?
I mean, no, they weren't. I mean, it was just this instinctual thing that I wanted to write about, and then then later on you're like, oh, I see why this is you know, why this is appealing to me right now. You kind of trust that your mind is fascinated, and you'll figure out as you're writing how they're connected, and that does happen, I think, because it's a reason why your mind is sort of going there. You have to trust that, I think. But I think with Oneida is so interesting. Like many things in the book, it's complicated in that it had this, you know, it had this great Bible communism and complex marriage, and this idea that, you know, that you can't possess other people. But it also had this like really creepy eugenics idea, syrup culture and spiritual eugenics. And it had this, you know, charismatic male authority figure who was the most spiritual. So it was also one of the few, I think, utopian communities that has ever been financially successful. You know, they still have Oneida silverware. That's, you know, so they're so fascinating in so many ways, and they're right here, right? And there were a lot of weird, well, whatever the word you want to use, there were a lot of alternative living experiments up here, and it was also a place where women could have different roles than in Victorian society, right? They could cut their hair, they could wear pants, they could run the printing press, and they didn't have to. And one thing that Oneida had is it practiced birth control. So you could sleep with everybody else, but you would also not be pregnant and dying in childbirth through your entire fertility, or watching your children die. And that was a real liberation too, from what, you know, there weren't many alternatives. So I think that it was so interesting to think about these alternative ideas of what you know, these utopian ideas that are both interesting and also creepy at the same time, and problematic, or whatever the word you want to say. And the getting that is interesting, and I think it's part of what she's trying to do is kind of salvage the good from what's not a good, and instead of just sort of saying all bad, which I think is, yeah, that's partially why she's so taken with old things and has her little cabinet of curiosities, right? You know, little artifacts or little pieces of things. Yeah.
But you know, but also sort of obviously that act of salvaging, being able to salvage the good from the bad, or whatever, just kind of embrace the complexity, is also, that's like a thing that's the novel is uniquely suited for, and our moment is sort of uniquely unsuited for. There's a really, for those who haven't read the book, there's like a great scene where, so she's a tour guide at the house, that Sam is a tour guide at the house of this like this fictional figure, Clara Loomis, who is, you know, who's like a sort of feminist radical, but also has these like eugenicist tendencies. And so she gets these like bored teen like, you know, justifiably bored teenagers coming to the house to walk, you know, to see it. And she's trying to find ways to entertain them. The most punk rock moment in the book is when she just she just like finds herself wanting to yell menopause, menopause, menopause at this group of kids. That was really, it was so good. But then, but of course, in fact, the only way to get these kids riled up, or the sort of the teenagers who come to visit, is to talk about, in one way or another, is to talk about the feminist stuff, sure, but really the way to rile them up is to talk about the fucked up eugenics stuff. But of course, this has the paradoxical effect of alienating them, right? And there's a great, as usual, as with Innocence and Others too, there's all this great, you know, internet ephemera in this book. There's Instagram, you know, hashtags, there's Facebook comments, and then there's this great Yelp. Is it Yelp? That's like,
yeah.
So there's like this Yelp review that one of these like teens leaves that's basically just like, can't believe we were taken to this fucked up eugenicist's house. And then Sam responds,
high key sketch. Yeah.
But that's like this, you know, in a way, that's sort of a wonderful, in the novel, like those kind of perspectives, literally those fictional quotes from Yelp can coexist, but not define the terms of the conversation, right? And then we can actually just like keep going and layering complexity.
See, I think that's exactly right, Mark. I think that fiction is a place where you can engage sort of the complexity of these conversations and the specificity of them, and you can kind of have a play with it and look long and deep at them in a way that you can't when you're advocating or you're making a point on Twitter or something like that. And it is an alternative space where there can be more turns, I think, more, because it is imaginative, it's imagination, it's not, the stakes are lower in a sense. So, and I think you can exercise some of these things, and I think Sam, you know, wishes she worked at a different house. She also has contempt for this woman, right? And that's why I thought it was like, then the book does another turn and says that, you know, she was once this idealistic young person too, and got these, you know, bad ideas. So it's kind of a, you know, interesting to sort of see that kind of turn and turn again. And I do like to put, it's perverse, I think, but I like that you call it the internet ephemera, but it is fun to do these other, take this old technology of prose on a page and try to speak to the technology of the moment, and the kind of make it a thing again and take it away from abstraction and kind of like put it into an object. That for some reason that's really interesting to me. I don't know why that is, but it's just, maybe it's because it's like, it's just enough off that you can kind of look at it in a way that you wouldn't when it's actually in real life, a virtual experience of some kind. So so I do kind of, and a lot of it is funny. I mean, a lot of it is really funny to me. So it's fun to do, and it is funny to, I think, Sam. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I mean, it's like, it's such a joy to encounter, you know, in these books, because and I remember in Innocence and Others, those YouTube comments are like in the first chapter, right?
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was also an extremely punk rock move, because like, it was very clear to me. I remember reading that book, like in Miami, like on the beach in Miami on vacation. I just like started it there, and I was like, it was just so exciting. But at the same time, I was like, there are going to be people who are going to close this book right here, because it felt incredibly confrontational, even as, you know, I think the literary case for it and the emotional case for it is sound. Here, in a way, here they're kind of they're integrated. Not that they weren't integrated there, but here I think you sort of work up to that a little bit, and they're sort of more in the world of the character.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's not really, I mean, she kind of goes offline pretty fast in the beginning of the book, but you know that, but of course you can't escape. It's still like, you know, it's still all this stuff happening. She's just not engaging with it, and so but it can become gimmicky, right? Like if you change formats too much, it can be distracting, it can feel gimmicky, it can feel irritating. So it's like you have to balance it in some way. It has to be essential
Yeah.
to what you're trying to do. And I feel like that's a hard thing to resist. Sometimes you don't want to just do it. It can be too easy and too quirky and too gimmicky,
Yeah. And I think, or it just becomes so much of a part of the project that then you really have to give yourself over entirely to that kind of to sort
Right.
of pastiche, which there's some contemporary novelists who I
Yeah.
love to do that, but that's a really different
Yes.
emotional space. There's this document that I'm like looking at another computer, so I'll find a way to get this into the chat. But you wrote this, like, I was just very struck by this. So on your website, you wrote out these author's notes on WAYWARD, which everybody can read. And I
An
just
ill-advised thing to do.
I think no, well, so like sort of the traditionalist would say it's definitely ill-advised, right? The novel should speak for itself. The author should shut up. Perhaps she should not even participate in Zoom conversations with
Right. Right.
But of course, for this reader, it's sort of amazing because it's like it's this sort of it's a lot of it is stuff that perhaps would have emerged in interviews, but it's written very much on your terms, and so which is exciting. But so I wanted to ask,
Like it's a little manifesto about writing novels. It becomes in the end. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. So I did want to sort of, I wanted to ask about sort of why you thought it was useful to do that, or whatever. But actually, like one sentence that I wanted to take from it. Oh, yes, Rachel has posted the author's notes. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, everybody should read this. It rules. But you write sort of early in these notes that my constraint was that the novel would take place in Syracuse and over part of one year, 2017, with one dramatic exception late in the novel. One of the things that I love about your books is that they are just hyper attentive to place. I mean, and every book is sort of hyper attentive to a different place. The early novels are very, Southern California and the sort of in the Southwest, and then I suppose as you moved east, the books moved east, right?
Got contaminated by the upstate New York.
Which, but that's great for me because I love the literature of California, but it's like it's nice to have those. But of course, I'm closer geographically. I'm closer to Syracuse, so it's good to have that illuminated. But I was curious about whether I assume that constraint, the Syracuse constraint, happened very early in the process for you. And
yeah.
I wanted to know sort of what the kind of the thinking about that was.
Yeah, I was toying with the idea of just not naming it and just making it, Syracuse, but making it a kind of post-industrial sort of Rust Belty, small American city, and just using Syracuse. And then I thought, well, just call it what it is. But I think, just like I think you're shaped by the house that you live in. I think that in one of my books, I think Jason and Eat the Document talks about how they're not suited for open plan houses. They should live in like rabbit warren house, because it makes them feel exposed. And I do feel that, architecture shapes who you are, but, and of course the extension of that is geography, and the place that you live in shapes who you are. And I think you'd be a very different person if you lived in a different place. So trying to figure out that the way that place shapes people, and there, so much of your identity gets shaped by where you are living, and trying to capture that seems really interesting to me. So I could almost write about any place. I am this is the place I live, so I am interested in it. But I think one of the things is that it does have this great history that is kind of, no one really thinks about that much. I mean, obviously some people do, but it's, the abolition movement, the women's movement, all that stuff that happened because of the Erie Canal. And I am obsessed with the Erie Canal. And I did like a trip on the Erie Canal with my friend Marie, I think, who's here. And that's another one of that's this kind of like, it's still around, but everybody pretends it doesn't exist. And there it is. And the old canal, you can find it in the woods. And I love that kind of palette list. I love that layering of things in plain sight that you just don't even know what they are. And then when you investigate them, I mean, like the empty Carnegie Library that's downtown here, it's just sitting there empty. It's just it's so interesting to sort of think, okay, how did this happen? Why is this here in the first place? Why did Carnegie do this? Why? And then why is it empty? And then where did all the books go? There's so many interesting questions that come out of place, I think.
Totally. And yeah, I mean, and that's like sort of my preferred way to read. And so it was just very exciting to, in a way, I feel like this is, of your books, this is the first one, despite the sensitivity to place in all of them. I feel like this is the first one that really goes all in a way, and sort of
That's true.
makes place its subject in a more explicit way. And in Innocence and Others, the town upstate is not, it's not
no, it's Gloversville, and they're in California. I mean, they're all over. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, that just leads me, I have to just like plug briefly, like, the acknowledgements are so great because there's like this like Syracuse history Instagram account. You think,
that guy, that's a great Instagram account.
The My Central New York blog, which I think it's just like great to encounter these things in the acknowledgements. But then I did want to just like, one of my favorite sentences in this whole book is from the acknowledgements, where you say, all the t-shirts described at the 2017 Great New York State Fair are actual t-shirts I saw for sale at the Great New York State Fair. I think that's like a really
and also the police butter sculpture, that was real too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really just, that's amazing.
Shockingly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, but so to get back to briefly, as long as it's not too painful, with so these author's notes, right? Like this, part of, in a way, one of the things that the novel also does, I think a little clandestinely, is that like it does illuminate, it sort of suggests one way for the contemporary novelist to, engage in with a world that is like, maybe intellectually, but certainly kind of emotionally quite hostile to fiction and to novels, not necessarily out of anti-intellectualism, but just out of like hyper intensity and the brain rot of social media and all the rest. And so with these notes, did you feel like you kind of had to explain yourself, or like explain the novel, what a novel does?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say that in there, is that, I feel, it's a kind of antiquated thing, novels, not that many people read them anymore. And I think there that I do feel like a slightly it seems that things might need to be said that might not have needed to be said in the past, to just sort of talk about why you'd write a novel, like why do it, what's it for? And it was mostly for myself to kind of think it through. And maybe it's because I teach, I feel like I have to think it through, and I don't mind. And the way I think is to put things in language. And then I just thought, well, I'll put it here and nobody will see it. And then Mark told the whole world about it. And no. I mean, I figure if someone's curious enough to come and see, you don't want to, you can't control how people respond to your work, and it should stand on its own. And I hope it does stand on its own. And so there is a warning at the top that says, like, you probably shouldn't read this. But it's no different really than doing an interview. It's basically interviewing yourself. And maybe it's just me being a power mad person where I want to control everything. And so I will interview myself about this book and control everything. And it turns out I can't control anything. So it don't work.
Well, very, very gentle, admirable form of control, as far as I'm concerned.
It's just it's a testament to my perversity, I think. Yeah.
Great. Well, please keep them coming. Keep the testaments coming. I'll just remind we have like, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 minutes. So if anybody has questions in the Q&A, throw them in there. But for now, obviously, I will just keep asking them. I did, and I think you mentioned this in an interview, so this is fair game. But when we were talking a little bit, kind of a few months ago, about sort of inspirations for the book, J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace was something that came up, and I would be curious to hear you sort of describe the relationship between that and this book a little bit, but also any other structural inspirations or something. It's a book that so stands on its own in a way that it's like, it was hard for me to sort of even like think it into other books. So I was curious if there was stuff you were looking at.
I think with that book, I was interested in this, it's a very tight book. And I was thinking about this and I was thinking about the Ollie Smith, I think it was Autumn, I forget which one it was, but I like the way that she talks about Brexit, but she keeps it in a very like local, intimate character plane, right? And it's sort of like, it's in this context, she's talking about it, but she's not doing this big sprawling sort of, you know, take on it. She's kind of keeping it very contained. And I like that about the Coetzee book too, that it's both, very much into this very specific political context, but it's done through this very specific character, and it really stays with him. And I think this structurally, the idea that I was struck by how dislikable he is, and how Coetzee is really like just doesn't soften him at all. He's sort of relentlessly dislikable, and that he blows up his life in the first couple pages, and then shit just keeps happening. And so part of me was just thinking along those lines, like blow up the life in the first couple pages, and then stuff's just going to keep happening, and it's still only going to be this long. So how I like, the compression of it and the escalation of it, and then this like the weird ending. And it's a very abrasive book in so many ways, and problematic book in a lot of ways, but the ending is so amazing. I think it's such a beautiful ending, that there's a slight hint of redemption, but it comes in the weirdest way for this character. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, because I know we don't believe in spoiler culture, but yes, that would be a big spoiler. Yeah. But I think it's worth, and I love books that have just audacious endings, that you just can't stop thinking about. Right. And I think, so that really spoke to me. And I was just really kind of being deliberate about writing about, thinking about cultural representations of middle-aged women, and what the cliches are, this kind of, and a lot of that is movies as much as books. But I was thinking about, of course you think about like Mrs. Dalloway and all that, there are lots of literary representations of middle-aged women, and Doris Lessing has, the Summer for the Dark is like a middle-age crisis novel, but I really didn't want it to be about, loss of beauty and loss of desirability. And I didn't want it to be like, I'm going to go have an affair with a hot guy. And that's, all that seems really boring to me, and not true, to what I think the real despair is with, or the real crisis of being at the point in your life where you're at the halfway mark, and you're not happy about what you've done with what you've been given, as I say in those author's notes. And then what does that mean? And what are you to do about it? But I was thinking this the other day. Do you know that the movie Ollie, Fear Eats the Soul, that Fassbender movie?
Sure,
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interesting, in the weird movies there's some interesting representations of older women that are kind of but again, that is romance. There is an affair in that. Yeah, it's hard to find one where there isn't some affair, right? But so I guess I don't know if that answers it, but yeah.
Cool. I'm glancing at the Q&A quickly. So there's a question from Paul Soda. Oh, well, so let's do this. We'll do them in order. Elizabeth Horvath says, love the book. I think it might be at once your funniest and most tender and heartbreaking. Not really a question, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Talk about the sentiment in the book, or the emotional. You started to talk about that, yeah.
I mean, and I do think, I think that's like a good. There is this way in which the books, in going back to your books, I sort of did kind of feel like your reputation for sort of like DeLillo coldness was like a little outsized in a way. I was like, these books are really full of feeling all along, of course, and they have these like,
I think that's kind of outsized for DeLillo. I mean, there's a lot of feeling in his books too, right? That people just don't see, but there's a lot of parts.
No, I think it's like
Underworld that are very moving. Yeah.
Underworld. Yeah, I was rereading Underworld last summer, and I was just it's so rich. But I think that like things like White Noise, and then his like these weird later books, which I like so much, but they're very they're really off into kind of in language. But
Right.
does that, yeah, I mean, I suppose that
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I just thought, it's been increasing since I think Eat the Document, that I wanted to write about um, emotional emotion without being sentimental, but just being, raw and true to the emotion and not being afraid of emotion, and because it's part of life. And I think it's a challenge to, I think when I was younger, I feared that it would be, I was imitating other writers, and I wasn't inhabiting my own space. And I'm a very emotional person, so it just wasn't being true to the way that I engaged the world. It was missing, I think, in my first novel, maybe. And so I wanted to find ways to be honest about and I'm interested in people who are deranged with emotion, like at a state in their life where they're deranged by emotion, like literally taken out of arrangement. That seems interesting, and certainly anger is an emotion, and love is an emotion, and so much of life is not determined by intellect, right? So that seemed really interesting to me. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that comment.
Um, and then we should, after this, we should probably wrap up. But
Yeah,
there's
Paul.
a great question from Paul Soto. I'll read it. So after focusing so thoroughly on the house as a setting and a source of identity, a symbol of renewal, and a symbol of freedom for Sam, did you redefine the concept of the house or home for yourself? How did you approach this fundamental dramatic setting differently in Wayward than in the houses and homes in your previous work? So these are two kind of distinct questions.
Yeah, I think she does kind of have this connection to the house that speaks to her. She feels as if it exists for her only. And I think the reason why it was for this character so important is I think there's a feeling that you get, which when you're in an old house or in an old building, even an old apartment building and you just realize this was here before I got here, and this will outlive me. And that's okay. That's interesting, and it's a way of thinking about your mortality. It's like a machine for understanding mortality, because you're in this thing that was made by humans, but they're all dead and you'll be dead, and it's like being in a graveyard in a way, but you're living in it. So I think that it seemed really important for the questions of this book and then when I got so into that house, and I can't get in it, it's all boarded up. I tried to break into it, but I'm not a brave person. And so I had to make up what it was like to be inside. But I did read all the descriptions, like the architect, Ward Wellington Ward, he wrote very specific descriptions to the artisans, like how to mix the paint and what to put in it, which I put in the book. They're so beautiful. So just there's something about that arts and crafts era where the attention, because it was consciously anti-industrial, right? They wanted to go back to handmadeness, and so everything, the attention to detail of making the house was extraordinary. And so just to read the description of how it was made and the instructions to the people to mixing the stucco was really quite moving. Yeah, so it was interesting.
This is like they put feathers. Was that what they?
Yeah, they put all kinds of horsehair into the stucco, and and of course the lead paint. Yeah.
The lead paint was great.
Yeah, I think it's like Brooklyn lead or something. Yeah, Brooklyn lead. Yeah, it's just the names are beautiful of the things, on a language level.
Reminded me of what's the color of the white in Invisible Man. It's like, what is it? It's something that pure white, some kind of like the whitest white. But that came to mind. Yes. Well, so to end on stucco, which I think is very, very appropriate for this sort of home-focused novel.
Thank you, Paul, for that question. Paul
great.
Goes to my MFA program. He's a great writer.
Great question. Yeah. Well, so again, just before I thank Dana, please buy this novel, Wayward. It's a really remarkable and beautiful book, and it's a real it's not long, but it's a real journey. And you cannot, as I learned, you cannot cheat your way forward. You can't read ahead and have it make sense. So you just have to read all the way through. Buy it
Thank
from
you so much,
one.
Mark.
Oh, thank you, Dana. It's really a pleasure.
And
And
Rachel.
those of you, yeah, if you're a subscriber, look out for the next issue soon, which will have a great excerpt from the book. Yeah, thanks again. Have a great weekend. And Dana, I hope to talk to you soon.
And thanks everybody for coming on your lunch hour or your breakfast hour or your midnight hour. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Of course. Let's see, I think
Bye.
we're going to get logged out here in a second.
Are we going to get locked out?